Part 47. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 461. On a quiet winter night, the building ship slowly sailed out of Nanjing port. The uncles of the Lu family and the Xiao family stood at the port to say goodbye. The watchtower on the port was still there. There were no thugs on it, but the government had not demolished it. As for what it would look like in the future, Su Buling can no longer control it. Lu Hongluan stood on the deck, waving goodbye to his brother. No one could say when he would come back from this trip. It was possible that by the time he set foot in Jinling City again, he would already be beautiful and with his children and grandchildren. However, women always have to leave their parents' home. They have already left once before, but now the crying reluctance has faded away. They only came back to visit relatives. The real home has long been with Su Buling. In the cabin of the cabin, Su Buling was still treated as a wounded person, lying on the bed unable to move. There is a brass stove burning in the room, and the windows are slightly opened for ventilation. You can see the lights on both sides of the Qinhua River slowly receding, and you can hear the shouts from behind the cabin. And, I was wrong. No one but Mr. Xiao can shout this voice. When preparing to set off in the afternoon, Xiao Ting could not be found anywhere. In the end, Xiao Ting's maid tipped off Xiao Ting and pulled him out of the boat on the Qinhua River. He was still playing role-playing and dressed up in a costume. The Prime Minister interrogated the enchanting courtesan who acted as a spy for the enemy country in court. Xiao Qi almost died of anger when she found out. If it weren't for the fact that the Xiao family only had 2 legitimate sons, Xiao Ting would have been expelled from the family. Nightingale sat in front of her, holding Su Buling's fingers and trimming her nails carefully, while she was still muttering softly. Young Master Xiao is really neither old nor young. He can't pretend to be the Prime Minister. He just tries the case. He also takes off the clothes of women in the hook. I heard that the shameless and shameless kill sister kept saying, "Xiao Xiang, don't do this." Su Buling wanted to laugh but felt it was inappropriate. He shook his head and said, "There is nothing funny about the joy of the boudoir." Xiao Ting's fault was not that he played Xiao Xiang, but that he was caught. Nightingale said oh, thought for a moment, and then said, "Is it like the young master pretending to be his true self and asking Sister Xiang to pretend to be a shy and humiliating Empress Dowager? If you are caught, it will be worse than Xiao Ting." Su Buling's cold face was a little confused, and he frowned slightly and said, "As we go, we are becoming more and more unruly. I've done everything, and I haven't let the maid talk about it, and there are no outsiders, ouch." After suffering a brain collapse, Nightingale shrank her neck in pain, didn't dare to be angry anymore, rubbed her forehead and ran out. The ship has already set sail, and it will take about 4 or 5 days to enter Hangzhou Bay down the river. Lu Hongluan was taken advantage of in the afternoon, and she was probably too upset to calm down. She didn't come to take care of Su Buling, so she hid in her room. Su Buling sat in the room for a while, but when Aunt Lu didn't come over, he got up and took the medicine and gauze prepared by Zhongli Jiju from the cabinet, and changed the medicine himself. As soon as she took off her robe, there was a knock on the door, and Xiao Qi's voice came. "Dong dong. Should you order it?" They were busy setting off in the afternoon, and Xiao Qi had been busy arranging the affairs of Jinling, and they didn't talk to each other. At this time, the ship set off and had some time to come over for a visit. Su Buling hesitated a little while holding the medicine, turned around and lay down directly, adjusted his posture to look slightly weak, and said softly, "The door is unlocked. Miss, please come in." Squeak. The door opened and Xiao Qi entered the room. When she goes out, Xiao Qi's outfit never changes. The slim black long skirt outlines her gourd-like figure. Except that the fabric is slightly thicker, it is no different from spring. Ru Mo's long hair is draped on her back, combed into the style of a girl who has not left the pavilion, but she has a very cold temperament. After looking at her for a long time, she has this very special attraction. On Xiaoqi's feet were black embroidered shoes, which were hard to find under the hem of her skirt. In fact, from Su Buling's point of view, a pair of black high heels would be more matching. However, if this idea is to be realized, she has to go back to please the baby. Xiaoqi walked into the house and saw the stove burning. To prevent the cold air from coming in, she closed the door. He walked slowly over and sat down on the stool beside the bed, his voice as gentle as ever. "How's the injury?" Su Buling had a strong expression and rubbed his shoulders. "It's nothing serious. It should be fine after a few days of rest." Xiaoqi sighed quietly, glanced at Su Buling a few times, and said, "We have nothing to do with each other yet, but I still have to talk to you about some things, and don't bother me. As a superior, you should stay behind the scenes and have an overview of the overall situation. How can you go out and fight on your own? I find that your personality is too strong and you like to use force to lift the table. It is impossible for a person to succeed 100 times in his life. If he makes one mistake, he will lose everything. I have been going smoothly all my life, but in the end I capsized over trivial things. If you continue like this, how dare I let Xiang'er follow you? I may be widowed one day." Su Buling always flipped the table when he was sure of everything he did. This time, he just didn't expect that Xuechenzi would come out halfway. Even so, the situation was under control. He wanted to find a powerful person to challenge Xuechenzi, otherwise he would have thrown away the dragon Lok Gu and ran away. Faced with Miss Xiao's earnest teachings, Su Buling naturally would not argue with her and nodded seriously. "Miss Xiao taught me a lesson." When Xiaoqi heard this, she narrowed her eyes slightly and was unhappy. "Who taught you a lesson? You didn't do anything wrong. I just asked you to pay attention to your own safety in the future." Xiang'er finally found a home. If she is a widow again, she will not survive. Go down. Su Buling smiled a little and thought for a moment. It sounds like Miss Xiao said this to herself. Xiaoqi's expression was not coy, nor did she deny it. She just said calmly, "You did that to me, so of course I have to think about it, otherwise I wouldn't tell you this. As long as you know it, go to bed early." With that said, he was ready to get up and leave. Su Buling said good night, then picked up the medicine, gasped in pain, and rubbed his shoulders. Xiaoqi paused and looked at Su Buling for a few times. When she saw that the maid was not there, she sat down on the bed again and raised her hand to take the medicine. "Return to Wu Kuei, aren't you martial arts practitioners afraid of pain? Even this minor injury makes you sigh." Su Buledenling looked helpless and leaned on the bed. After Xiaoqi babbled a few words, she raised her hand to unbutton Su Buling's clothes. After seeing Su Buling's strong chest, for some reason, her eyelashes trembled slightly. The lights in the room were dim, swaying gently under the ups and downs of the ship, and the sound of quiet breathing seemed to be absent. Neither of them spoke, making the atmosphere gradually strange. Xiaoqi wanted to avert her gaze, but the arrogance in her bones did not allow her to have stage fright. She pretended to be calm and untied the gauze. When she saw the scabbed wound, her eyes relaxed a little. She put on the wound medicine and rebandaged it with gauze. The injury was under the ribs, and the bandage was wrapped around the chest. Xiaoqi wanted Su Buling to turn around, but she felt that it was inconvenient for Su Buling to move. After thinking about it, she opened her hands generously, and Su Buling never made her arms open. "Pass it under your arm, trying to wrap the gauze around your back. This posture is no different from throwing yourself into a hug." They are so close to each other, and a faint fragrance is coming to their nostrils. Xiaoqi's eyes moved into the room. Her face was exactly the same as Xiang'er's without any shyness, but her eyes were obviously a little uneasy and her breathing was a little stagnant. Su Buling looked calmly, staring at Xiao Qi's apricot eyes, and whispered in a gentle voice. Kikai, you are so beautiful. Xiao Qi pursed her lips and didn't want to answer. She wrapped the gauze around and tied a beautiful knot on her chest. After packing the bottle of medicine, she stood up and wanted to leave. Just as he stood up, his wrist was held. Xiao Qi's eyes panicked slightly, but she immediately regained her usual composure, turned around and frowned. Is there anything else? Su Buling smiled and thought for a moment, well, do you want to listen to poetry? I have recently remembered a few good works. Xiao Qi was so disturbed by those obscene words that she couldn't think of anything to think about and twitched her hands. I don't want to hear it, you read it to others. Su Buling sighed and changed the bait. Don't you want to know how I will arrange it in the future? I will discuss it with you carefully. Xiao Qi's mind was focused on the general trend of the world. When she heard this, she hesitated obviously. She really wanted to know what Su Buling planned in the future. If she wanted to rebel, she would still have to bear the humiliation. She had to be given the right words. Xiao Qi thought about it for a while, sat down on the bed again, and said calmly, say it, don't be secretive, otherwise my analysis is wrong, and you will be the one who suffers. Su Buring smiled softly, moved a little further inside, and patted the quilt next to him. This matter is too involved, and we must not let outsiders know about it. Besides, you have to reassure me that it's not. Xiao Qi was very smart and understood that she was not allowed to hand in a nomination certificate, and her eyes suddenly became angry. Are you still afraid that I will harm you? It's just that I've been beaten by you, that's all, if I don't listen. Su Buling held his wrist and chuckled softly, how could I not believe you? It's just that it's a long story, so we have to sit down and talk slowly. I'm injured and can't move, but I won't do anything to you. Xiao Qi is not as easy to fool as Xiang and she doesn't believe this nonsense at all. However, after glaring at Su Buling for a moment, he kicked off his embroidered shoes and leaned against the bed with his skirt on, far away. Is it okay now? Su Buling nodded and chuckled, extinguished the candle with a flick of his finger and lowered the curtain. Xiao Qi panicked when she saw this. She couldn't see anything in the dark hole, so she wanted to get up and lift the curtain to go down. As a result, someone held her ankle and pulled her down gently. She lay down, and then her body was covered with blood. It sank so hard that she almost couldn't breathe. You, bastard, let me go. Xiao Qi was buried in the thick quilt, and the man's hot breath hit her face. It was difficult to even move. She closed her eyes and turned her head. She wanted to call for the guards to come over, but for some reason she didn't dare to call out. Instead, she biting the man on the shoulder. The bite of the little tiger's teeth was painful, but Su Buling didn't care much, and his voice was a little stronger. How cruel are you? Have you forgotten how you begged your brother last time? I'm just going to find a quiet place to discuss things with you. Xiao Qi's chest felt a little uncomfortable due to the pressure, and she felt even more ashamed and anxious. She couldn't push away the dead Su Buling, so she had to let go of her mouth and responded angrily. Then let's talk about it. Why are you suppressing me? Get up and think that I, Xiao Qi, am easy to bully, right? Su Buling raised his hand and pinched Xiao Qi's chin, and said seriously. My future arrangement is to marry the Xiao and Su families and marry you back as the princess. Are you honest enough? Xiao Qi knew she had been deceived, so she angrily hit Su Buling on the shoulder, and struggled to get out of the bed. If you dare to touch me, this marriage will be over, and I will never agree to it to you. Su Bulenling nodded, stood up, and let go of Xiao Qi. Suddenly her body was empty. Xiao Qi thought that Su Buring was about to pick up the gun and mount the horse. She closed her eyes suddenly and hugged her chest with her hands. Her pretty face was a little nervous with shame and anger. She kicked her feet lightly in the quilt and touched the chopping board. It looks like a fish. How dare you, I. After a while, Xiao Qi saw no movement, and opened her eyes in confusion. What are you doing? If you dare to make such a mess. Su Buling leaned against the wall and looked at Xiao Qi, who was acting helplessly. After all is said and done, what else can be done? Xiao Qi lay on the pillow and hugged her chest. When she realized what she was doing, her face turned red immediately. Without saying a word, she turned over, raised her foot and kicked Su Buring, then leaned out of the curtain to look for her embroidered shoes. Before his hand even touched the shoes, he was dragged back again. Yeah, you. If you don't want to leave, don't leave, just think I'm using force. You are so presumptuous. Someone, with you. Tear. The curtains were swaying, and the hesitating voices lasted less than half a quarter of an hour before falling silent. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 462. Under the same night, Xiajiazhuang outside Huainan City. The courtyard of the deep house seemed a little deserted without the male master, and the maids gathered around the house to keep warm. The rivers and lakes are very lively these days, and Su Buling's story is being spread everywhere, something like, the contemporary Qing Kui battled the gun god Xuechenzi in Hongshan Lake, and fought bloody for 3 days and 3 nights, shaking out the deep water dragon king. And so on. Zhu Manzi liked these the most. He took Ningqingyi to spend time in tea houses and wine shops, and didn't come back until late at night. Song Yafu didn't like worldly affairs and spent most of her time in the house. She had been used to never leaving the front door since she was a child, so she wasn't too bored. Xiao Xiang who was hiding in the back house, was a bit pitiful. Home is right in front of me, but I dare not show my face in public. I have to sit alone in the house during the day and night. Without my smelly brother by my side, it feels like I have returned to the lonely days in the palace. The snow has passed, the sky is clear, and the moonlight is faint. Xiao Xiang wearing a bright red dress, was leaning on the carved sofa in the boudoir. Her makeup was exquisite and her features were picturesque, but no one could appreciate her. Her white fingers gently rubbed the small mahogany sign in her palm, and every few seconds she would turn over and let out a light sigh. Speaking of which, Su Buling had only been gone for 10 days, but in the past 6 months, Xiao Xiang had been with Su Buling day and night, which was almost a long time apart. Xiao Xiang is not a loose woman, but she still likes doing that kind of thing with her sweetheart. Nothing happened in the first 2 days after leaving, but the longer time passed, the more upset I became. I felt that time passed very slowly, and the days passed like years, even slower than before in the palace. I kept looking for things to do, but I couldn't get rid of them in my mind. Open Su Buletinling's shadow. Especially tonight, I don't know why, but it feels like Su Buling is right next to her, talking to her. Woo! Xiao Xiang's face turned slightly red, and her hand moved down involuntarily. When she noticed something was wrong, she took it back. She muttered secretly, I must have been possessed by an evil spirit, then she concentrated hard, trying not to think about Su Buletinling. The misery of staying alone in the empty boudoir. In the past, I didn't feel anything after enduring it for 10 years. Once the meat is turned on, and then staying alone in the empty boudoir is simply. Xiao Xiang's eyes moved to the small purse next to the pillow, and she raised her hand to get the golden quail egg. In the end, she slapped herself on the face and spat, Are you ashamed? Let that shameless person. When I came back, I found that it was fine, just hold it in, he must be suffering too, he won't do it himself, how can I do it myself? After staying up like this for half an hour, just when Xiao Xiang was confused and about to bite her lip, Qiao Yi appeared and finally saved her. Miss Zhongli is here. She said that the young prince asked her to come back. Zhongli Jiju is deeply involved in medicine, and is especially good at all kinds of strange medicines. Xiao Xiang'er has been studying all kinds of weird and obscene techniques since he was a child. They used to get along on the boat. When he heard that Zhongli Jiju was back, he was naturally happy. Xiao Xiang'er woke up, adjusted her clothes on the soft bed, and said softly, "Please invite Miss Zhongli to come in, you are almost suffocating me." "Okay." A moment later, master and disciple Zhongli, who had rushed back from Jinhu County, entered the back house. Zhongli Jiju was a little disappointed when she found out that Ning Yuhe was not there. When she heard that Xiao Xiang'er asked her to go over and have a heart-to-heart talk, she was naturally happy to establish a good relationship with Su Buling's bedfellow, and followed Jiao Yi to Xiao Xiang'er's wing. Zhongli Chuchu couldn't help but follow him. Under the leadership of the maid, he came to live in a room in the west wing. When walking through the corridor, I happened to see a quiet girl standing in front of the painting table from the window, painting. Song Yufu. Zhongli Chuchu had just arrived. He only knew Ning Qingyi and Manzi, but was not familiar with Song Yufu. However, after having a conversation on the boat last time, I had a good impression of this shy and quiet girl. I stopped immediately and called out from the window, "Miss Song." Song Yufu was carefully painting Su Buling's beauty picture. When she heard the sound, she raised her head and glanced up. She saw Zhongli Chuchu, whom she hadn't seen for many days, coming over. She quickly closed the scroll, bowed and opened the door. "Miss Chuchu, why are you here so late at night? Mr. Su is back." Zhongli Chuchu walked into the boudoir that was full of books and spoke softly, "Master Su is going to Hangzhou. It was inconvenient for Master and I to follow him, so we came back early. The room is not big. Apart from the daily furniture, the only thing that catches the eye is the portrait of a man on the wall, with a vermilion wine gourd placed under the portrait." Zhongli Chuchu's eyes were focused on Su Buling's portrait. She had heard about Su Buling's picture of beauty before, but this was the first time she saw it with her own eyes. She couldn't help walking up to it and taking a closer look. There was a portrait of her boyfriend hanging in the room. Song Yufu was a little embarrassed after all, so she stood in front and explained softly, "I asked my uncle to draw this for me and keep it in the house for collection. Miss Chuchu should have one too, right?" Zhongli Chuchu nodded lightly. "Su Danking gave me the painting. There was no one to give it to. It has been kept on the camel and I almost forgot about it." Song Yufu didn't know the relationship between Zhongli Chuchu and Su Buling, but they definitely didn't know each other. After thinking for a while, she asked with a smile, "Why don't Miss Chuchu give it to Mr. Su? He likes to collect these things." Zhongli Chuchu didn't know much about Su Buling, and felt that she didn't even care about her in person, nor would she care about a picture scroll, so she never had the nerve to show it. Hearing Song Yufu talk about it, I was a little surprised. "Really?" Song Yufu poured 2 cups of tea, sat down on the couch, nodded and smiled softly. "Sister Xiang'er is also a Bakui. She gave her painting to Mr. Su before, and Mr. Su secretly hid it under the bed. I dug it out, and then Mrs. Lu caught her." At this point, Song Yufu remembered her forced kiss on Su Buletinling, and her face was still a little shy. Zhongli nodded thoughtfully, picked up the teacup and took a sip. "Miss Song and Mr. Su have known each other for a long time." It was quite early. Not long after Mr. Su came to Chang'an, he went to the Imperial College to study. We met at that time. I was taking students to the Imperial College for morning reading. Mr. Su was cold, arrogant, and fierce. He never came to the study room on time and kept hiding. I was copying books in the bell and drum tower, and I didn't say a few words for a year. I was quite afraid of him at that time. When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, his attitude towards Song Yufu was naturally more serious. In her impression, Ning Qingyi and Zhu Manzi met later, and Song Yufu was considered a childhood sweetheart. Then Miss Song, how did you meet Mr. Su? Judging from your relationship, it looks pretty good. Song Yufu thought about it and chuckled, I am a serious person. Once when Xiaoting did not obey the rules, Mr. Su came to the school and bumped into him. He beat Xiaoting on the spot. I felt something was wrong, so I wanted to talk to Su Ting. Young master was reasonable, but in the end it was me copying books in the bell and drum tower. Zhongli Chuchu drank tea for a moment and felt something was wrong. Didn't Mr. Su say that Xiaoting likes to complain and cannot be offended? Song Yufu was a little amused and shook her head, how is it possible? Mr. Su is so domineering in Chang'an that he dares to beat anyone. What's the use of Xiaoting's complaint? He even brought his aunt to Mr. Su's bed, cough. Zhongli Chuchu frowned slightly, feeling a little uncomfortable. It seems that Mr. Su really didn't want to talk to her and just found a reason. Thinking of this, Zhongli Chuchu was a little unconvinced and thought for a while. Miss Song, Mr. Su doesn't like to talk to others. Unexpectedly, Song Yufu nodded seriously, yes, I was looking for trouble at that time, but Mr. Su was annoying me. He threw me downstairs and threatened me. I accepted death and refused to leave. Finally, that's what. Zhongli Chuchu was stunned, Master Su ignored you at first. Mr. Su treats everyone the same, just like the fairy who can't eat the fireworks of the world. The reason why Miss Manzi has such a good relationship with Mr. Su is because she helped a lot in Chang'an City. When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, he felt something was wrong again. According to Song Yufu, Su Buling should be relatively indifferent to everyone and only become warm after getting to know each other, but Ning Qingyi obviously didn't say that. Miss Song, I heard from Qingye that when Mr. Su saw her, he became smooth-talking and acted like a playboy. How is it possible? Mr. Su is not that kind of person. Song Yufu quickly shook her head and explained to her boyfriend seriously, there are so many beauties in the capital. Many princesses and princesses blocked the door and wanted to see Mr. Su. Mr. Su went out without any excuses. How could he treat a woman he didn't know? Glib tongue. Ning Qingyi is indeed handsome, but Mr. Su is not bad in appearance. He will never win the heart of a beautiful woman with his smooth tongue. In my opinion, Mr. Su's silence is enough to seduce his daughter's family. Zhongli Chuchu's views were exactly the same as Song Yufu's. He felt that he had met his confidant and immediately said doubtfully. Ning Qingyi told me personally that it was Mr. Su who took the initiative to pursue him, and even said a lot of things that only a disciple would say. Could it be that she was lying? Ning Qingyi has a straightforward temper and is colder than Mr. Su, so you won't use this kind of thing to show that you are valued by Mr. Su, right? Song Yufu sipped her tea, holding some words in her heart for many days. Because Zhu Manzi and Ning Qingyi were best friends, she did not dare to say them to Manzi. At this time, Zhongli and Chuchu were chatting about this, hesitated for a moment, and whispered. Chuchu, let me tell you something. Don't tell outsiders. It's not something shameful, but it's not a good idea to spread it out. Zhongli Chuchu blinked his green eyes and nodded seriously, I'm not an outsider, I know what's appropriate. Song Yufu looked at the window to make sure there were no outsiders around, then she leaned into Zhongli Chuchu's ear and whispered. Ning Qingyi looks cold, but actually, well, let me tell you the truth, I went to see Mr. Su one night and found that she was. Zhongli Chuchu listened quietly, a look of shock gradually appeared on her charming face. After listening, she said in disbelief. How is this possible, Ning Qingyi actually? Song Yufu sighed, leaned on the couch with the teacup, and frowned, I didn't believe it at first, but I saw it with my own eyes, and Mr. Su also admitted it. At first, I admired Ning Qingyi for his high martial arts skills. He has an independent personality and is not afraid of Mr. Su. Now that I think about it, this is what happened. Zhongli Chuchu was full of anger. Because she believed Ning Qingyi's nonsense and thought Su Buling would treat her differently, she valued Ning Qingyi but not her. For this reason, she traveled thousands of miles from Suzhou to Jiangnan. I wonder if I am ugly. I see. It's a shame that I consider her a friend, it's just. Zhongli and Chuchu held it in for a long time, not knowing what to say. After all, it was a private matter, Song Yufo said softly, don't talk nonsense about this matter. Ning Qingyi definitely doesn't want anyone to know about it. If it spreads, he will definitely cause trouble for young Master Su, and young Master Su will come to me, I will definitely tell you what you spread. When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, he was immediately frightened and nodded. It was getting darker, and there were noises and chattering voices in the corridor of the backyard. Xiaoning, it's a pity that you didn't go out with Master Su this time. Your martial arts are so poor, are you going to be a burden? Hey, can't you be more tactful when you speak? Looking back, Ning Qingyi came over with Zhu Manzi, dressed in white and elegant, like a cold fairy who doesn't care about the world. Zhongli Chuchu and Song Yufo stopped talking, their eyes were very strange, they glanced at Ning Qingyi's figure, and then looked away. Ning Qingyi didn't realize that in the eyes of her sisters, she had become a little vixen who was cold on the outside but coquettish on the inside and relied on her body to seize the initiative. After seeing Zhongli Chuchu, she greeted her with a plain smile. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 463. The next morning, the winter sunshine shone on the windows, the ships were still rising and falling, the copper stove had been extinguished, and the room was a little cold. Su Buling leaned on the pillow, wrapped the quilt tightly, and looked at the eldest lady on his arm in the dim light, smiling with a bit of amusement. Xiao Qi only had the chance to sleep in the early morning. Her cheeks were still a little flushed, and her black hair stuck to her cheeks, making her look a little lazy. Her heartstrings that had been tense all year round were released and relaxed, and even her skin became a little more shiny. As the saying goes, a good girl is afraid of being pestered by a man. Xiao Qi was so teased that she couldn't do anything about the fuss last night, but she finally complied half-heartedly. Once the tough mind relaxes, it is not easy to recover. It is like the dam poured on the heart collapses. The hundreds of emotions that have been accumulated in the heart in the past are released at once, and they almost forget what they called themselves. But this time Xiao Qi was awake and not as cooperative as last time. She closed her eyes and looked like she was being tortured, holding the quilt and refusing to make a sound. Su Buletinling found it boring, so he stopped halfway and pretended to take a rest, deliberately teasing her. Xiao Qi waited for a long time without getting up or down. Seeing that Su Buring was not moving, she quietly opened her eyes and took a look, then closed them again. After waiting for a while, she found that Su Buring was still not moving, so she raised her hand to hit someone. Hurry up, are you finished? Afterwards, the two of them hugged each other and fell asleep. Xiao Qi also took out her small purse and gave it to Su Buling. Inside the purse was a piece of cloth cut from the palace with a red plum blossom printed on it. Su Buling didn't expect Xiao Qi to think of this in that situation, and she felt a little guilty in her heart. But these things can definitely only be made up for later. It was getting dark and everyone on the boat was awake. Su Buling was admiring Xiao Qi's face when he remembered the sound of ghosts crying and wolves howling behind the cabin. And, I was wrong. Xiao Qi's eyelashes trembled a few times, and then her body trembled slightly. She opened her eyes suddenly, and met Su Buling's eyes. After a moment of silence, she hurriedly flipped it up, holding the scattered skirt with an indignant expression. You bastard, you actually dare to take me? Su Buling was a little confused. He covered Xiao Qi's shoulders with a quilt to avoid catching a cold, and said softly, "Isn't it fine last night?" Xiao Qi's memory seemed to only stay in the time when Su Buling tricked her into coaxing her into bed. Her eyes were as cold as a bullied lioness, and she said in a deep voice, "Nothing happened last night. If you dare to tell anyone about it, I will still not marry you. Don't think that if you use force on me, I will be yours." "Well." Su Buring nodded and tilted his head, "It's still early, do you want to? Don't even think about it." Xiao Qi was afraid of being discovered, so she didn't dare to stay in the room. She put on a thin black belly band, maybe because her heart was too flustered. She couldn't fasten the lace behind her for a long time, and she saw Su Buling tilting his head and looking at her next to him. His eyes, he looked a little annoyed again. "You tie it up for me, it will take it off, right?" Su Buling coughed slightly and raised his hand to tie a bow. Xiao Qi put on her skirt in 2 or 3 times, walked to the door with her embroidered shoes, listened carefully, and after making sure there was no one in the corridor, she walked out quickly on tiptoes, looking like a young lady who was eating out. When Su Buling saw this scene, he felt something was wrong. It seemed like he was being taken advantage of. But men shouldn't care about this gain or loss. The ship just went down the river and entered Hangzhou Bay 4 days later. It followed the Qiantang River and entered the capital of Jiangnan, probably the most prosperous city in the world. It was also the first day of winter, and there were still 2 months until the end of the year. Muzhu, 100 miles away, was the hardest hit area by the floods. Hangzhou was also affected to some extent. Many refugees gathered outside the city. However, what is gratifying is that the large shanty towns built outside the city protected the affected people from the severe cold. There were officers and soldiers escorting the grain truck over, and the flag of Prince Wu's mansion was planted on the truck. Su Buling disembarked at the pier and accompanied Lu Hongluan by car to Hangzhou. Seeing this scene, Lu Hongluan showed some approval in his eyes. King Wu has a good reputation in the south of the Yangtze River. With the flag of Prince Wu's palace flying, it seems that King Wu himself opened the warehouse to provide disaster relief. I'm afraid it will cost a lot this winter. Su Buling nodded slightly, but had nothing to say about this. When there is a famine in the territory under the jurisdiction of a vassal king, disaster relief is a matter of course, but under normal circumstances, public funds are used for disaster relief. Taking out the money oneself is equivalent to the emperor not using the national treasury, but opening his own internal treasury to help the people, which is indeed selfless. Xiao Qi was also sitting in the carriage. When in public places, she always looked calm without changing her face. She looked out of the carriage and couldn't tell what she was thinking. Xiao Ting was in a good mood, and he waved his fan to his aunt enthusiastically in the cold winter. "Auntie, last time I just went for a drink. I drank a few too many drinks and didn't have any romantic occasions. If you don't believe me, ask Su Buling. In Chang'an back then, Su Buling and I were the 2 most noble and notoriously unapproachable women." "Color. He doesn't like women?" Xiao Qi's eyes were slightly cold. When Mrs. Lu heard this, she hesitated to speak and lightly bumped Su Buling with her elbow. Su Buling couldn't help it. Xiao Ting hit the knife edge himself. Wouldn't his words add fuel to the fire? "Really, Su Buling and I are as clean and self-sufficient. When we were in Chang'an City, countless girls blocked us outside the door. We never paid attention to it and only focused on reading the books of sages." Xiao Qi wanted to teach her a few words but didn't know where to start. The cold wind made her face hurt. Unable to bear it, she raised her hand and pointed outside. "Get down here." Xiao Ting stood up and ran out as if he had been pardoned. Upon seeing this, Xiao Qi said coldly to the guard outside, "Don't give him any money." "Ah!" Xiao Ting's steps froze. He was about to turn around and say good things, but was afraid that he wouldn't be able to get out, so he said, "What do I need the money for? I just go out and see the scenery. Xiao Qi rubbed her forehead, worried that her stupid nephew would be embarrassed if he went out to eat the king's meal, so she waved her hand and asked the guards to follow. The carriage finally became quiet, but once Xiao Ting left, the atmosphere became a bit awkward. Su Buling looked at the two charming beauties. Out of boredom, he placed his hand on the side of Mrs. Lu's leg and rubbed it gently. Lu Hongluan's eyes suddenly widened, he lowered his head, moved slightly to the side, pinched her secretly, and then motioned for Xiao Qi to be beside him. Su Buling smiled softly, stood up and sat next to Xiao Qi, and said, "The eldest lady seems to be in a bad mood these days, but what's bothering you?" Xiao Qi's eyes were slightly cold. She couldn't say that she hadn't recovered from being raped by Su Buling a few days ago. She said calmly, "I'm thinking about King Wu's birthday banquet." "It's nothing." Su Buling nodded, looked out the window, moved his hand quietly to Xiao Qi's back, and slid it down from her lower back. The King of Wu opened a private treasury to provide disaster relief. It seems that the government really cannot accept the money. Xiao Qi sat up slightly and her eyes widened, a little unbelievable. He glanced at Lu Hongluan opposite him calmly. When he saw Hongluan looking out the window, he breathed a sigh of relief and pushed Su Buling's hand away with his elbow. "The imperial court's taxes are too heavy, and there is little money in the treasury, you." Xiao Qi was not a submissive woman. She was rubbed here and there a few times. Seeing that Su Buletinling was still getting excited, she turned around and glared, "Su Buletinling." Lu Hongluan was startled by the angry voice, turned around and asked doubtfully, "What's wrong?" Su Buring didn't expect Xiao Qi to be so courageous. He coughed lightly and acted innocent. "Yeah, what's wrong?" Xiao Qi stared at Su Buling coldly, held her breath for a long time, and then continued. "Hongluan is here today. Tell me clearly. How many women do you have outside? If you want me to marry you, you must explain these clearly." Lu Hongluan was confused. He was talking about King Wu just now, but why did he suddenly change the topic to this? She quickly helped Baobea to explain. "Miss, your child has always been clean and self-sufficient, and has never been involved in promiscuity outside. Well, but there are indeed a few girls with whom I have a good relationship. They are all girls from the Innocence House. I have met them all." Su Buling secretly sighed, "It's better to have an aunt," nodded and chuckled, "Yes, Aunt Lu made it very clear." Xiao Qi stabilized the situation and naturally stopped asking any more questions. She snorted lightly and sat far away. The carriage, accompanied by a group of guards, marched on the official road filled with carriages and horses. After walking for about half a quarter of an hour, they arrived outside the city of Hangzhou. Seeing the Xiao family's carriage approaching, Han Xianchu, who was waiting outside the city gate with a bunch of Hangzhou officials, hurriedly stepped forward to greet him. "Welcome Prince Su and Miss Xiao to Hangzhou." King Wu heard that the prince arrived today and wanted to come in person, but his old illness has not healed and he has difficulty moving. He specially asked Han to prepare a banquet at the Minghe Tower in the West Lake for the prince and Xiao. The young lady takes the wind and washes away the dust. Many aristocratic families came to Hangzhou for the birthday banquet of King Wu. Su Buling did not raise the flag of King Su, but asked his staff to bring Hangzhou officials out of the city to greet them. The standards could be said to be very grand. Su Buling lifted the curtain of the car and glanced at it. He had no intention of letting the Hangzhou officials wash their hands of the wind and dust. He nodded slightly and said, "Thank you very much King Wu for your kindness. I will have a good time catching up with King Wu at the birthday banquet tomorrow. I am a little tired from the long journey. Please go back." Han Xianchu knew that Su Buling looked down on these official social events, and he only came here to deepen Su Buling's favor for King Wu. He did not insist on it at the moment, and watched Chazu and all the disciples of the Xiao family enter Hangzhou city. Pai recommends a book, I Just Want to Be Self-Reliant, Mid-Autumn Moon, the latest masterpiece by a hard-working author who has produced more than 30 million words continuously for 10 years, with an average of over 10,000 updates per day, and who never asks for leave even if he breaks a bone. I had no choice before, but now I just want to be self-reliant. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 464. On the second day of winter, King Wu celebrates his birthday. King Wu is the oldest among the 7 vassal kings. Over the years, he has managed Jiangnan in an orderly manner and has a high prestige in the court. The vassal kings from all over the country and the city of Chang'an have sent envoys to celebrate his birthday. The nearby kings of Yu, the king of Wei, also sent his nephew to come over in person. Because of the floods in recent months, there were many homeless people inside and outside the city who were hungry. In order to appease the people, the birthday banquet was not decorated with lights and colorful decorations all over the city. The banquet was just held at Prince Wu's mansion by the West Lake. It was just afternoon, and the long and wide street outside Yahuang Mountain was filled with cars and sedans. We walked in front of the dismounting monument. Yahuang Mountain is located between the West Lake and the Qiantang River. From a distance, it looks like a giant dragon lying down. When the wind blows and the clouds surge, you can see the vast lakes and mountains and the vast river and sky. The scenery is so beautiful that it far surpasses the sea of artificial flowers in the Suzhou Desert. Su Buling got off the carriage and saw this magnificent palace. He couldn't help but sigh that the gap between them was too big since they were all vassal kings. On formal occasions, Mrs. Lu is only the daughter-in-law of the Xiao family and cannot represent the Jinling Lu family, so she and Xiao Ting walk behind. Su Buling followed Xiao Qi over without showing off the ceremonial guard of the prince. However, his reputation has become too great recently. When many officials and gentry saw the handsome young master next to Xiao Qi, they knew who was coming. They quickly stopped by the road and raised their hands to salute. See Prince Su, Miss Xiao, long time no see. Today, almost all the powerful families from Jiangnan are here. Even Xuechenzi sent his son to bring congratulatory gifts. However, the Jianghu people's status in front of the princes is too low, and they can't be found anywhere in the corner. Su Buring didn't know the heads of these wealthy families, but most of their family histories were older than that of the Su family, which had just emerged in the 1960s. Maybe many of the books he had read were written by their ancestors, and their postures should not be too high. Arrogant, he just smiled and nodded. Xiao Qi has been walking around Jiangnan all year round, chatting with representatives of many aristocratic families quite familiarly. She has a high attitude but does not offend the other party, and her demeanor is impeccable. Outside the Zuki Gate, Song Yulu, the second son of King Wu, was receiving guests. When he saw Su Buling arriving, he quickly stepped forward and raised his hand to salute. Brother Su, Miss Xiao, you two have come to congratulate your father on his birthday. You have not come out of the city to greet you in person. I have really treated you badly. Please come in quickly. Song Yulu is not very old, about 17 or 18, but his gentle words and elegant appearance already show a bit of stability. Su Buring had never met Song Yulu, but he heard Xiao Qi talk about several of King Wu's descendants. The eldest son was very smart at a young age and was deeply loved by King Wu. Unfortunately, his ship sank while on a tour in the south of the Yangtze River. The young prince also died young because of this. The second son of King Wu, who is now the crown prince of Wu, was still studying in Chang'an City. He and Su Buling were classmates and knew each other. They were idle all day long and had no talent. However, at the feet of the emperor, even Su Buling had to hide his clumsiness and pretend to be a fool. Naturally, the other princes were similar, and it was not sure whether the Prince Wu was hiding his clumsiness. Song Yulu was the third legitimate son of King Wu. Although he was not well known, he was still the second in line to the throne. His status was aloof, and there was no problem in calling him brother-in-law with Su Buling. Su Buletinling's expression was very easygoing. He greeted her politely, and then took Xiao Qi into the large palace in Yahuang Mountain. The palace was full of distinguished guests, and the pavilions and pavilions of Longtai were filled with famous families from all over the country. Su Buling even saw a few officials from the capital whom he had seen in the Tai Chi Hall. The status gap was too big for the other party to come over and say hello, so he just nodded and saluted from a distance. The birthday banquet has not yet officially started. As soon as Xiao Ting entered the palace, he ran to have a family time with the princes and nobles he knew. Su Buring and Xiao Qi came to a living room near the main hall to drink tea and wait. Except for the maid who started pouring tea and water, but no outsiders disturbed me. Xiao Qi sat quietly on the chair, frowning slightly, obviously thinking about something. Mrs. Lu looked at the people coming and going outside the window, seeming to be looking for acquaintances she had met when she was a child. Su Buling sat between the two of them, thought about it for a moment, and turned his head to look at Xiao Qi. Is that Song Yula just now highly valued by King Wu? Xiao Qi is smart and is actually thinking about this matter. She guessed that King Wu would not rebel. Firstly, it would be difficult to achieve anything without troops. Secondly, King Wu's crown prince was still in the capital. The so-called proton was used to restrain the vassal king. It was impossible for King Wu to ignore his own son. But after meeting Song Yula just now, Xiao Qi felt that a son was nothing compared to power. It was not like King Su who only had a single seedling. If the son in the capital was gone, there would still be a third legitimate son. As long as he was ruthless, the proton in Chang'an can be treated as if it does not exist. But even so, King Wu's undefeated troops were a disadvantage. If he wanted to attack Chang'an from the south of the Yangtze River, he would have to push the king of Wei, the king of Yu, the king of Chu, and the Guanzhong cavalry equally. Even King Su didn't have this ability. Wu Mr. Wan cannot go overseas and become king in Japan. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi shook her head and said softly, King Wu attaches great importance to several of his children. It is difficult to tell from this alone. Don't make any assumptions. First, see what King Wu is looking for. Su Buletinling nodded lightly and said no more. Waiting quietly in the living room, the palace became more and more lively, the sky gradually became dark, and the peaceful West Lake outside the mountains could be seen in the distance. Su Buling was idly admiring the beautiful scenery of the West Lake. From the corner of his eye, he saw a servant passing through the corridor. When he turned around, he disappeared. Su Buling felt something familiar, frowned and thought for a moment, then said, I'll go out and have a look. He got up and left the living room. There was a crowd of people outside the main hall of the palace. In the garden, the gentry and officials gathered in groups to call themselves brothers and sisters. The maids and servants walked through to entertain the guests. Su Buling walked quietly through the corridor and came to the palace garden. He stood in a viewing pavilion and pretended to watch the night view of the West Lake. Within a moment, I heard footsteps behind me, and a servant carrying a tea tray walked past. Su Buling glanced at him from the corner of his eye. The servant was dark-skinned and looked very ordinary, but he had met this man once in Grandpa Fuebao's village. He was called Erhe by Fuebao, and he should have been born in Mike. Junior brother. Su Buring was a little surprised. He didn't expect that Grandpa Fuebao was so tough that he could even sneak into the palace. Erhe passed behind Su Buling with a tea tray, slowed down slightly and said softly. Master asked me to bring you a message. The power of kings is divinely granted, and wisdom will confuse the central plains. If you can understand, you can make your own decisions, but if you can't understand, you can honestly return to Suzhou. Su Buling frowned slightly, and after carefully thinking about the 8 words, the power of kings is divinely granted, and the wisdom of the central plains is chaotic, he felt a little confused and turned around. As an old man, can't he speak human language? He snorted imperceptibly, took the tea tray and left. Quite arrogant. Su Buling spread his hands slightly, he really didn't like this kind of riddle-like news. Just like the old saying, it's difficult to become a Taoist by going against the will of nature, but you can transform into a real dragon by following the trend. Just follow Songji's path and it's enough. Why are you talking about it in the clouds and making people guess? The power of kings is divinely authorized, and the wisdom of the central plains is chaotic. The king's power must be the throne, so what the hell is divine right? The central plains is in chaos. Su Buling thought carefully for a moment, and the only thing he could be sure of was that Grandpa Fuebao had seen clues and knew that someone wanted to cause trouble in the central plains, and it was probably the king of Wu. However, he did not point out what method or how to operate it. Seeing that the birthday banquet had begun and the guests were all walking to the main hall, Su Buling could only remember it in his mind for the time being and quickly returned to the living room. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 465. In the splendid main hall, many guests were sitting. Su Buring and Xiao Qi were sitting at the first place on the right side, with Wang Zuoyan and others nearby. Madame Lu and Xiao Ting were at the back, chatting politely with the young master and his wife. As the lights on the west lake lit up, the birthday banquet officially began. With the support of his son, King Wu Song Siming slowly came to the main hall and sat down. This was the first time Su Buling met King Wu. He had heard that King Wu was suffering from old illnesses, but he didn't expect that he was so skinny that it was difficult to stand firm. His complexion was also very weak and he seemed to have little strength. However, King Wu was in a good mood. He first made some remarks about the recent disaster. Representatives from all parties came forward to congratulate him on his birthday. King Wu responded one by one. His words were fluent and his thoughts were clear. It seemed that the injury had not affected his brain. Su Buling also had the suspicion that King Wu was bewitched by the words of a demon. Seeing this scene, he gave up this idea. After the formal etiquette was over, many guests began to toast and sing congratulations. King Wu was too weak to drink, so he asked his son to take his place. He turned his eyes to Su Buling on his right and said with a smile, "But what I have done recently makes me feel quite happy. Yang Yingxiang is a scumbag who deceives his superiors and hides things from his subordinates. If you hadn't helped me clean up my family, I would still have been kept in the dark." Su Buling knew that King Wu would be the first to forgive him for killing people, so he nodded and chuckled. "I didn't know the relationship between Yang Yingxiang and Prince Wu beforehand, otherwise I would have said hello to the prince first." Hey, King Wu raised his hand gently. "The Su family, the dignified king of Su, should draw his sword to suppress the law when there is injustice. Without this decisive courage to kill, General Su would not have been able to bring peace to the world. Even so, it was a bit too risky to be in Hongshan Lake a few days ago. Hongshan Water Village is easy to defend and difficult to attack. I should say hello to the king and let you go there with your troops. This is bullshit." If Su Buling dared to ask for military power in the south of the Yangtze River, the news would have reached the ears of the emperor. Then he would not have to suppress the bandits and could just go directly to Chang'an City to receive the reward. Su Buling smiled and nodded at this. "I have been a bit impulsive since I was a child. I didn't think much about it at the time. Now that I think about it, I was a bit reckless." King Wu sighed. "You are young and energetic as you should be. You will have to lead troops to intimidate Northern Qi in the future. If you are hesitant in doing things, problems will really arise. However, your martial arts skills have really opened my eyes. Jiangnan has a strong literary spirit. The only one who can fight is there was only one Xuechenzi, and you beat him to the ground. I heard that before you came to Jiangnan, you single-handedly entered the Black City. This is right to the point." Su Buling was a little anxious when he saw King Wu slowly bringing the topic to jade. He was originally here to show King Wu the jade, so he answered the question neatly. King Wu thanked you for the award. I was just casually walking over there, and happened to meet Prince Zhoujiang's birthday banquet. I even grabbed a family heirloom jade pendant from him. King Wu was a little surprised to see Su Buling being so righteous. He hesitated for a moment, nodded and chuckled. I have heard people say that this move is very satisfying. Su Buling took out the jade pendant from his arms, took out the hairpin from his head, held it in his hand and looked at it a few times. Yes, I heard later that the world was looking for these 4 jade articles. Unfortunately, the sword spikes obtained from the Cao family were lost, and only these 2 were left. I heard from Wang Ruiyang that the king of Wu liked jade articles quite a lot. Wang Ziyan, Han Ziyanshu and others were slightly silent when they heard this. They were surprised, and at the same time, their eyes also showed surprise, and they were just shy of praising them. The rhetoric that King Wu had been thinking about in the middle of the night last night had no effect at all. He was still a little confused for a while. He looked at the 2 jade articles that he had been thinking about for a long time and didn't know what to say. Su Buling played with the jade articles and continued, "These 2 jade articles are quite rare. They should have been given to the king of Wu. Unfortunately, when they got them, they were promised to the girl of his choice. As the prince of the feudal lord, he could not compete with him. The servant has not kept his word, so I ask King Wu not to blame him. In public, when it comes to this, King Wu cannot forcefully ask for it." He pretends not to care and nods with a smile. "I am indeed interested in this jade article left over from the previous dynasty, but it has been promised to the girl's family. Your father will laugh at you if you steal her love with a sword. Now that I have come to Hangzhou, I must stay in Hangzhou for a few more days, so that I can fulfill my duty as a landowner." Su Buling knew what King Wu wanted to say, so he raised his hand generously and handed the hairpin and jade pendant to King Wu. "It's natural. The prince likes jade, so it's no problem to keep it for a few days. In fact, it's not a rare item." Seeing Su Buling's cooperation, King Wu was really touched. If he had known it earlier, he would not have listened to the counselor's unwise tactics. He would have just waited in Hangzhou. King Wu looked at the jade, but did not shirk his politeness. He raised his hand to take it and looked at it for a few times, then put it casually in his hand, changed the subject, and talked about the common family shortcomings. Naturally, Su Buling did not continue to talk about the jade, and he skillfully interacted with King Wu. "You flattered me and I flattered you, looking like a happy guest and host." Xiao Qi sat quietly beside her while drinking and eating. Her expression was calm and she did not look at the expressions of the people around her easily. She seemed to know nothing and was just accompanying Su Buling to celebrate his birthday. After obtaining the jade, King Wu obviously did not focus on the birthday banquet. After being polite to the guests for a long time, he stood up, took the jade, and left the seat accompanied by his attendants on the grounds of being ill. The banquet is not over yet, but it is almost as good as the protagonist leaving. Seeing this, Xiao Qi cooperated and acted like she was tipsy. She raised her hand and rubbed her forehead. "Prince Su, I'm a little dizzy." "Oh, how about I send the eldest lady back to rest?" Su Buling answered the question, stood up, said goodbye to King Wu's son, and left the palace first. Song Yulu knew that Su Buling came to Hangzhou to propose marriage to Xiao Qi, so he naturally didn't see anything strange. He stood up with a smile and sent Su Buling and others out of the palace. Lu Hongluan and Xiao Ting were outsiders and didn't know the inside story. They felt a little strange when they saw that Xiao Qi, who used to be a teetotal drinker, drank too much. Leaving early, Xiao Ting still had some unfinished ideas, so he followed slowly. After Su Buling and Xiao Qi got on the carriage, he followed and complained a few words. "Auntie, I'm drunk after just a few glasses of wine, you have to practice in the future." Unexpectedly, when he opened the car door and went in, there were only Xiao Qi and Lu Hongluan in the car, but Su Buling, who had just got in, was nowhere to be seen. Lu Hongluan was also a little confused, lowering his head to search under the soft cave, muttering, "Where are you, Ling Er, where have you been hiding?" Xiao Qi asked her stupid nephew to come in quietly and explained casually. "Go out and find me some hangover soup. I'll be back later. Let's go first." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 466. The winter night was quiet. The palace, which encompassed half of Yahuang Mountain, was brightly lit, and the outer house was still filled with the noise of guests. After Su Buling and Xiao Qi separated, they came to the West Lake, changed into night clothes in a secluded place, jumped into the tall wall of the Wu Wang mansion from the dark, and walked towards the back house from the top of the building. Handing over the jade pendant was naturally to see what the King of Wu was looking for. Since the King of Wu was in a hurry to leave, he must have made thorough preparations in advance to test the authenticity of the jade. If he didn't check it at this time, it would be too late when the King of Wu returned after using the jade. The palace was huge, but the King of Wu was inconvenient to move, so he had to take a sedan chair to walk in the palace. Su Buling crawled on the top of the gorgeous building, and with his extraordinary hearing and vision, he soon found the King of Wu Song Siming sitting on the carved sedan chair in the distant corridor. Song Siming held two jades in his hands, with a very cautious expression. Next to him was the counselor Han Xianchu, holding two wooden boxes in his hands. If he guessed correctly, they contained a sword tassel and another jade. Wang Zuyan of the Wang family in Hangzhou also walked in front. The distance was too far to hear what was said, so Su Buling followed silently in the dark. Soon, the sedan chair arrived at a three-story viewing building by the lake. There were soldiers and armor outside the building, and the people accompanying were left outside. Su Buling observed carefully, and with his extraordinary lightness and insight, he bypassed the guard's sight, came to the bottom of the viewing platform along the lake, hooked his 5 fingers directly into the beams, climbed up silently, listened to the footsteps inside to determine the location, and finally stopped outside the room on the top floor. Su Buling knew that there must be masters around, so he held his breath and carefully scratched a tiny gap on the window paper, and took a look inside. The large room was very empty, with a shelf in the middle, full of candles and bronze mirrors, and rice paper in the middle of the shelf. In addition to the seated King Wu, Han Xianchu and Wang Zuyan stood near the shelf, and there was a middle-aged man in a scholar's robe standing next to him, with his back to him and his hands behind his back. If Su Buling hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would not have thought that there was a fourth person in the room, who looked like a top master. Let's start. King Wu sat on the couch, rubbing his fingers, staring at the wooden shelf intently. The middle-aged man in a scholar's robe took out 4 jades, the last one was a jade bracelet. The 4 jades were placed in different positions on the shelf, and he flicked his fingers to light the fire stick, and lit the candles one by one. As the candle light lit up, the room became much brighter. The light was refracted by the bronze mirror and gathered on the jade, causing the shadows of the 4 jades to fall on the rice paper. Because the jades had different light transmission effects, the shadows were also different in brightness, and some fine lines could be vaguely seen in the shadows. The middle-aged scholar carefully adjusted for a moment, and after making sure that the shadows were all clear, he took out a brush and carefully drew the lines on the rice paper. The room was silent, with only the slight sound of the brush tip passing through the paper, and everyone focused their attention on the rice paper. Since Su Buling had not discovered the middle-aged scholar beforehand, it meant that the other party's internal breath might be longer than his, so he didn't even breathe in and out, holding his breath and squinting his eyes to check. In the room, Wang Zuyan frowned and looked for a moment, then said in doubt, "The terrain looks like Yozhu Bodhi Island. The clan has been here for business before." When King Wu heard this, He frowned slightly. Yuzhu, where exactly is it? The shadows are more complicated, and once the pen is put down, it will block the light. The painting is not fast, and it took half a quarter of an hour to draw the general outline. Zojaixian's seclusion must have arranged a lot of maze-like tricks like the old man in Yuelu Mountain, and the correct route was not drawn so quickly. Su Buling held his breath for a quarter of an hour. His face began to turn blue, but his expression did not change. He still held the brick wall with his 5 fingers and stuck to the window to wait for the result carefully. But when Su Buling was watching in a trance, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart and found something wrong. It was the slight signs before the danger came, which were enough for the top warriors to notice. Su Buling did not care about being discovered by the people in the room, and pushed the wall without hesitation, pushing his body out of the air. The next moment, the cold light in front of him shocked the sun and the moon, like a cloud dragon entering the bay. A white afterimage flashed past the place where he was just now. There was no sound, and the sharp sword had already smashed the entire window. It was so fast that it was shocking. If Su Buling was a little slower, he would have been torn to pieces on the spot. Su Buling had been in this world for a few years, but this was the first time he was frightened and almost lost his position. His heartbeat was several times faster in an instant. The sword was so fast that it was obvious that he was not inferior to Xuechenzi. Su Buling could not fight with others in a dragon's den. He didn't even have time to see the white shadow, and he stepped on the wall and fell directly into the deep lake below. Plop! After falling into the water, Su Buling's body turned into a black arrow and fled from the bottom of the water. The speed was so fast that a white line that could be seen spreading outward on the water surface was drawn by the naked eye. Whoo! The window exploded and the sound of falling water came almost at the same time. Only then did the people in the house shout in shock and anger, and the soldiers downstairs turned around in confusion. Su Buling jumped more than 10 feet in the icy lake water in the blink of an eye, poked his head out of the water, looked back at the situation, and the scene he saw was horrifying. On the brightly lit observation deck, 2 figures leaped out one after the other. The sharp sword of one of them almost blocked the moonlight, and the sound of the sword was like a dragon's roar in the sky. The other person, the middle-aged scholar, was almost ghostly. He leaped into the air without making any sound, but his speed was even faster than that of the swordsman. He was obviously a top-notch internal martial arts master. 2 afterimages rushed out from the viewing platform, and under the black sky, rushed towards Su Buling, who was swimming away from the lakeshore at a high speed. Tap, tap, tap. Although he was in the water, Su Buling heard clear footsteps. He looked back in a hurry, but saw that the 2 guards who rushed out were directly stepping on the water surface, and their speed was not much slower than running on land. Su Buling's eyes showed some astonishment. He followed the external martial arts style. His swords, spears, swords and fists all emphasized opening and closing, fierce and domineering. He practiced Beiji instead of Taiji, and was not very good at the internal martial arts of floating on water. As far as he knew, even a skilled fighter who used the inner family's skills couldn't run so far on water. 100 steps at most, and it would consume a lot of energy. It was really scary that the 2 of them were walking on flat ground. Although it was very dark and he couldn't see who was chasing him in the water, Su Buling recognized that the one using the sword must be his father-in-law Zulu. He swam in the lake at an astonishing speed like a black bar in the waves. Although his posture was not as handsome as his father-in-law's, his speed was much faster, and he was more practical. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 467. On the viewing platform, King Wu, Wang Ziyan, and others put away the jade pendants and watched the 3 figures moving away at an incredible speed on the terrace. They all showed some confusion in their eyes. It was also the first time they saw Li Hanzhong take action. Obviously, they did not expect that he could be so powerful. They wanted to let the guards chase him, but after seeing the guards of the palace jump into the water and slowly swim into the lake, they gave up the idea with self-awareness. On the other side, Li Hanzhong and Zulu ran side by side. In a moment, they ran more than 100 steps on the lake. They found that the speed of the escaped person was a bit exaggerated, and it was getting farther and farther. Li Hanzheng's eyes showed some doubts. Who is it? Zulu chased at full speed with a long sword in his hand, and whispered, I can't see clearly. Wang Zuyan let it slip just now. He might have heard it. He must not let it go. Okay. After a brief exchange, Li Hanzhong raised his hand and slapped Zulu on the back. The sword master Zulu, who was speeding on the water, increased his speed again, soaring into the sky and flying directly towards Su Buling. Li Hanzhong slowed down due to the reaction force and fell into the water. Su Buling heard the sound of breaking wind behind him, and thought it was not good. He had never expected that there would be such a trick. He had no helpers and no sword, so he could only dive into the dark lake to avoid it. The next moment, the sword pierced the lake surface, making a loud bang, and stirred up waves more than 10 feet high on the water surface. Zulu crashed into the lake, raised his hand and stabbed Su Buling's back with a sword. After stabbing in the air, he did not stop, but dived into the bottom of the lake and chased him relentlessly with swords like rain. The lake water in winter is not deep, only about 1 person high. After Su Buling touched the bottom, he stepped hard on the gravel at the bottom of the lake, and the surrounding lake water exploded immediately. He jumped out of the water diagonally more than 10 feet high and pounced on the pleasure boat cruising on the lake. Li Hanzhong, who was swimming like a hunter in the lake, also grabbed and swept over the place where he was just now, splashing water like a waterfall. Ah! Monster! Screams and shouts were heard from the pleasure boat enjoying the night view on West Lake. All kinds of talented men and beautiful women, looking at the surging waves gradually approaching on the deep lake, all hid to the other side, hugged each other and screamed in fear. Soon, the pleasure boat shook violently, as if it hit something. In the horrified eyes of the boatman, a figure in night clothes rose from the lake, crushed the fence of the pleasure boat with 1 foot, and jumped to the top of the boat building. The man in white robe holding a sharp sword followed closely behind, and the tip of the sword almost cut past his ankle. There was a crackling sound of wood breaking inside the pleasure boat, as if something had broken the boat plank and entered the pleasure boat, and the boatman in the lower cabin screamed and shouted, water leaking. Su Buling didn't even have a chance to breathe. He jumped to the top of the ship and smashed the roof with a punch, and fell into the cabin full of lights and wine. His eyes swept over the panicked talented men and beautiful women, and he rushed to a rich man who was pretending to be with a sword, drew his sword and hit the window again. They were all on the boat. Zulu was not much faster than Su Buling. He chased him from the roof into the cabin and chased him out of the window, but he lost sight of Su Buling. Zulu's eyes changed slightly, and he raised his hand in the air and stabbed upwards with a sword. Su Buling, who was hanging upside down under the eaves of the ship, thrust out a sword, but was blocked by the tip of Zulu's sword, and the fierce force directly bent the sword blade. Su Buling turned his wrist and stabbed 3 swords in a row, forcing Zulu to fall to the lake below with no place to gain leverage, and then he flipped over and jumped onto the roof again. But Su Buling jumped out from the eaves, and before his feet landed on the tiles, the roof exploded. Li Hanzhong smashed the dome of the ship, and the tiles and beams were broken into pieces when he waved his sleeves, but his body was erratic. The 5 fingers of his hands were like hooks, hidden in his sleeves, silently grabbing Su Buling's heart and throat. Su Buling's heartstrings were tense, and the long sword in his hand danced quickly to try to break the sleeves that fanned over, but the sword tip was like stabbing into a ball of cotton, without any sense of force. He wanted to retract it, but the blade was entangled. Li Hanzheng's left hand wrapped around the long sword, and his right hand had already stretched out, following Su Buling's arm to grab his throat. using Su Buling's Eagle Claw School's unique skill, Crane Capture Hand. Fortunately, Su Buling had learned how to break the move in his last duel with Xuechenzi, and he smoothly grabbed Li Hanzhen's elbow, while abandoning the sword, and raised his hand to hit the opponent's chest with 3 punches. Bang bang bang. The 3 punches landed on the chest at the right time, but there was no feedback, which was not much different from hitting an empty piece of clothing. However, this also made Li Hanzheng retreat a distance. Su Buling took advantage of the situation and landed on the ground to pursue the victory, trying to kill the tricky palace guard in front of him in one set, and then talk to his father-in-law Zulu. At that moment, his fists were like dragons, and his feet shook a large part of the roof. Li Hanzheng was forced to retreat, and his eyes showed some surprise. Obviously, he underestimated the opponent's fighting power. After noticing that his opponent was using Bajiquan, his aura suddenly changed, his robes fluttered against his body, and he threw out his right fist with a bang, with a flawless transition between soft and hard. Bang! In the blink of an eye, the 2 fists met, and the tiles under their feet were all shattered. They both stepped back 3 steps to stabilize their bodies. Su Buling felt his fists go numb, and the wound under his ribs that had healed broke and felt a stinging pain. He didn't dare to fight for long, and turned around and rushed towards the lake. Unfortunately, before he jumped off the eaves, Zulu, who had fallen into the water, had already rushed up from below, with a long sword that brought a curtain of water splashes, and the sword tip reached Su Buling's throat. Su Buling didn't know the details of the middle-aged scholar. If he was a crony of King Wu, everything would be exposed. He couldn't just reveal his identity and let Zhu Daijian Sheng stop. He bit the bullet and somersaulted back to the roof, taking advantage of the situation to hang the gold upside down. Hook, kick to the back. Li Hanzheng was flying behind Su Buling when he saw a kick coming down. While blocking with his left arm, he punched Su Buling in the chest with his right hand. The huge force on his leg smashed Li Hanzheng, including himself and the roof, into the cabin. Su Buling was hit by a punch and caught the beam of the roof. He spun around and landed on the roof. Facing Zulu, who had already rushed over, he quickly backed away and whispered, "Father-in-law, it's me." Zulu, whose sword was like a rainbow, was stunned when he heard the sound. He immediately put away the iron sword in his hand and landed lightly on the height of the already tilted boat, with some doubts in his eyes. Su Buling didn't have time to explain, so he jumped into the lake. Li Hanzheng fell into the cabin, but returned to the roof in an instant. After realizing that Zulu stopped chasing, he also stopped and frowned. "What's wrong?" Zulu watched the black shadow in the lake go away and said softly, "You can't kill him even if you don't order him." Li Hanzheng landed next to Zulu, with a hint of astonishment in his eyes. "I just suspected it was him. There is no one else who can stay in your and my hands for so long without falling. What happened just now, did it affect him if he heard about it?" Being able to come over and eavesdrop means that you have already made a guess. It doesn't make much difference whether you heard or not. I told King Wu that he was from the imperial court and is already dead. I just told King Wu that the imperial court has noticed it and must take action as soon as possible. Zulu nodded, raised the iron sword in his hand, looked at the gap on the blade, shook his head and said, "It's too strong to be used with a sword. No matter how good the sword is, it won't be enough to damage this type of fighting. Good punch." After Li Hanzheng responded casually, he jumped off the boat and boarded the boat that came to rescue the tourists who fell into the water. Zulu stood there for a moment, watching Su Buling leave, and then quietly retreated. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 468. It was a quiet night, and the Xiao family residence in Hangzhou was still lit with lights. The house belongs to an uncle of the Xiao family. The Xiao family has been working in the south of the Yangtze River for thousands of years and has properties in almost every place. When Xiaoqi arrived in Hangzhou, she naturally settled here. There was a heater in the side room of the house. After Xiaoqi took a bath and changed clothes, she sat on the sofa and combed her hair. After sleeping in the same bed with Su Buling that night, Xiaoqi resumed taking baths 3 times a day. It's not that I feel unclean, but I'm just doing it for Su Buling to see. She didn't like Su Buling licking her, even if she kissed her face and mouth, he actually kissed her from head to toe, and there. I can't push it away. Xiaoqi felt quite comfortable in her heart, but after all, that kind of thing was beyond her comprehension, and she didn't want Su Buletinling to take care of her. There was no way to stop Su Buling, so we could only use this method to make Su Buling understand, she doesn't like it, and she won't be allowed to do that in the future. But Xiaoqi doesn't know if there is any use in doing so. That's her character. She has to resist, and she can't just accept it like other women. It has been a while since I came back from the palace. Su Buling went to inquire about the news, but he has not returned yet. Xiaoqi stopped Su Buling at that time, feeling that something might go wrong if the palace was heavily guarded, but if Su Buling was not allowed to go, the matter of the jade would not be investigated clearly, so in the end she could only agree to cooperate. Now that Su Buling hasn't come back for a long time, Xiaoqi is still a little worried. Xiaoqi walked around in the boudoir for a while, unable to think quietly, so she sat in front of the dressing table and looked at the rouge box and various rarely worn jewelry. A woman looks after someone who pleases her. Xiaoqi was rational to the extreme. She originally thought that she only saw the general trend of the world in her eyes and had no personal feelings. But now that she could subconsciously sit in front of the dressing table, it already explained a lot of things. Fortunately, these two things were not in conflict, and Xiaoqi did not resist her inner thoughts. She picked up a red pen and lightly outlined her red lips. The dim light illuminated the long tulle skirt, and you could vaguely see the slim and graceful figure underneath through the thin fabric. The belly band was still black, but there was a bouquet of plum blossoms on it. The thin trousers clung tightly to the legs, and the white feet were put on embroidered shoes and put them together neatly. The beautiful lady's dotted picture is breathtakingly beautiful. After Xiaoqi finished the careful description, she looked carefully and suddenly felt that she looked a bit like Xiang. After thinking about it, she put on a colder expression and looked at the bronze mirror a few times before her eyes showed some satisfaction. Dong dong. There was finally a knock on the door. Xiaoqi quickly stood up, leaned on the pillow, supported her cheek with her hands, picked up a book, opened it, and whispered. Who? I. Come in. Squeak. The door opened, and Su Buling walked in silently, his body still wet and like a water ghost. Just as he was about to speak, he looked up and saw Xiaoqi with gorgeous makeup, wearing more interesting pajamas, leaning on the couch reading a book. Her cheeks were plump and pretty, but she still looked like she was repelling others. Su Buling raised his eyebrows, put aside what he had just said, raised his hand to untie his wet robe, and chuckled. The weather is so cold. Xiaoqi heard the rustling sound and raised her eyes, only to realize that Su Buling's clothes were soaked and there was blood seeping out from under his ribs. How did you do this? I accidentally fell into the water, it's no big deal. Xiaoqi quickly put down the book, looked at it, walked to the back room, picked up a blanket, and took a white cloth from the cabinet. Seeing that Su Buletinling had taken off his clothes, he bit his lower lip and looked away. Su Buring took the blanket and put it on his body, sat down on the sofa, raised his hand and untied the wet gauze. It was inconvenient to change the gauze with one hand. Xiaoqi hesitated and sat down next to Su Buling, asking him to raise his hand to help bandage. Go to Prince Wu's mansion and find out what you can find. Su Buring wrapped himself in a blanket and thought for a while. The king of Wu drew a map on 4 jade articles. I can't see clearly, but I heard Wang Ziyan said it was Bodhi Island on the coast of Yuzhou. Is there anything specifically you are looking for, Herd? Bodhi Island. Xiaoqi recalled carefully, but there was nothing of value, so she shook her head and said, I guess I have to send people to Bodhi Island to wait and see. If there is such a big battle, what we are looking for is definitely not an ordinary object. The gauze was quickly changed and the bow tied again. Su Buling picked up the teacup and took a sip of water, and continued, but today I was at the palace and met the old master from Yuelu Mountain. He must have come to explore what he was looking for in the jade. I don't know if he was found, that old gentleman, and gave me a message. Xiaoqi is well aware of the abilities of the old immortal in Yuelu Mountain. He has hands and eyes that know almost everything. He is the figure who sits at the top and plays chess. After hearing this, she naturally became more serious. What did I bring you? Su Buling was a little cold when he fell into the water just now, so he lay on the couch with a blanket. Seeing that Xiaoqi was wearing light clothes, he moved inside. Is it cold if you wear such thin clothes? Let's squeeze together. Seeing him, Xiaoqi was appetizing again and stared at her beautiful eyes. Just say what you want to say, and then talk about other things after you finish talking. Su Buling understood. With a bright smile, he raised his hand and pulled her over, stuffing her under the blanket and covering her. I'm just telling you, I'm afraid you'll catch a cold. Su Buletinling was not wearing anything. Xiaoqi's face turned a little red and she twisted her shoulders a few times symbolically, but did not struggle to get up. She just frowned and said, say quickly. That old gentleman, Shen Shen Nao Tao, brought me a saying, the power of kings is divinely granted, and the wisdom of the central plains is confused, and asked me to figure it out for myself. If I can't figure it out, go back to Suzhou and stay there and don't go out to fool around. The power of kings is divinely granted, and the wisdom of the central plains is chaotic. Xiaoqi huddled in Su Buling's arms, frowned, thought carefully, and said softly, judging from the meaning of the words, it must mean that King Wu wants to use his strategy to cause trouble in the central plains. It seems that this is indeed the case at the moment, but I can't tell what the plan is or where to start. The power of kings is divinely granted. The so-called Son of Heaven means the king has Father, Heaven, and Mother Earth, and is the Son of Heaven, which means that the emperor's power is given by heaven and cannot be watched by mortals. I bring you this sentence, which may mean that King Wu, I want to start from this aspect, inside public opinion, impeach the current emperor as unworthy of being the emperor, and make Songji abdicate. It is too far-fetched. It is difficult to shake the foundation of the current emperor with heavy taxes and refugees in Jiangnan alone. At most, he will commit a crime. Yazeo. Su Buling listened carefully to the analysis of the beauty in his arms, and finally got some ideas. He frowned and said, if the disaster in Jiangnan and the loss of a large territory in defeat are enough, will it be enough? Xiaoqi thought about it carefully and hesitated, not sure. Dayu has never been defeated since the founding of the country. It is also because of this that Chang'an can make the vassal kings obey their orders. If defeat shakes the status of the current Holy Emperor, unless the imperial court directly the eastern front under their jurisdiction was defeated by the northern Qi dynasty. Even so, the 6 vassal kings of the Song family did not dare to replace them easily. If there is no legitimate reason, the country will not be able to sit firmly. When Su Buling heard this, he had a vague idea, but he couldn't figure it out for a while. The same was true for Xiaoqi. There was too little information, and no matter how much analysis she did, she couldn't figure out the reason, so she fell silent at the moment. The room became quiet, and slowly only 2 breathing sounds were left. After a long time, Xiaoqi's breathing became slightly unsteady and she spoke softly. Su Buletinling. You hit me with something, get it away. You can help me get it? I don't, hate it. The lights went out, and in the cold winter months, a little spring breeze seemed to blow again. Thank you, little bear doesn't eat vegetables for the huge reward. There seems to be double monthly passes at the end of the month. Please give me some monthly passes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 469. Madam, don't wait any longer, go to bed early. You said that your daughter went out to look for hangover soup, but she didn't come back. It's been a few hours, your daughter definitely didn't go out to look for hangover soup. She disappeared late at night, and you hid it from me. Thinking about it, I feel, something's wrong. Madam, don't think too much. The eldest lady is so arrogant. She will definitely not let the young prince go out to drink wine and help cover up. What kind of flower wine? I'm just curious about what tricks Ling Er and Xiao Qi are doing behind the scenes, and why they hide it from me. The candlelight was dim, and in the back room of the house, two charming women were sitting on the blanket. According to the health-preserving method taught by Zhongli Jiju before, they posed in a very unique posture, which was a bit like yoga, but the range of movements was not that big. Lu Hongluan's bust was the best among all the women, and her buttocks were also rare in the world. If she had the goods, her flexibility was naturally worse than that of a little bean sprout like Nightingale. It was a bit difficult to press her legs, so she held on tremblingly. Yunu bent down beside him, with a few beads of sweat hanging on his cheeks. Having grown up together since childhood, I know Lu Hongluan's character best. Seeing her keep talking about Su Buletin Ling's whereabouts, I know that if I don't figure it out tonight, I won't be able to sleep. After thinking for a while, he said, Madam, the young prince may have something to do, it should be serious business. When Lu Hongluan heard this, his eyebrows showed a bit of displeasure, and he whispered. Anyway, you just kept it from me, when we were in Chang'an City, you know, Ling Er told me everything and never left me alone. It's better now. Xiang Er spends the whole day what's going on with Su Buling and me. What? It has nothing to do with you, it can make people mad, and Xiao Qi is like this in just a few days. I can't listen to serious matters. I am also the daughter of the Jinling Lu family, just a generation younger than them. That's all, she's not an illiterate fool. Yunu chuckled. The young prince is afraid that you will worry, so he won't tell you some things. This is because he cares about Madam. Yes, I let Xiang ride on me, and you kept it secret from me. If I hadn't bumped into it myself, I would probably still be in the dark. During the chat, it was almost the third night. When Lu Hongluan saw that Su Buling hadn't come back yet, she couldn't help but feel a little worried. She got up from the blanket, picked up the shawl and put it on her back. Yunu also got up and advised, Madam, you don't want to go out, do you? Hangzhou is such a big city, it's not good to go out at night. What am I going to do? I just want to ask Xiao Qi. While Lu Hongluan was talking, he opened the door and walked along the veranda of the back house to the courtyard where Xiao Qi lived. The back house is where the owner and his female family live. It was getting too late at this time, so except for a few lanterns hanging in the corridor, there was nothing else. Lu Hongluan came to the door of the inner courtyard. Before he entered, he saw the Nightingale girl suddenly appeared from behind the door. She blinked her big eyes and said nothing, as if she was thinking of something to say. Lu Hongluan was thoughtful, and his face suddenly showed a bit of suspicion. The gatekeeper of Xiao Qi's yard should be Orchid. What is Nightingale doing here? And if you look at any door in the middle of the night, there must be something shady going on. Thinking of this, Lu Hongluan narrowed his eyes slightly, leaned closer, and asked softly. Nightingale, is your child in Xiao Qi's house? When Nightingale was selected in Prince Su's mansion, the first person she met was Lu Hongluan, who promised to help inform the news. At this time, Lu Hongluan asked. It was obviously not possible to lie to others, so he could only whisper. Well, madam, the young master and Miss Xiao are discussing something very important. Discussing things. Mrs. Lu looked at the crescent moon in the sky, frowned and said, a man and a woman alone, in the middle of the night, what are we discussing? Nightingale chuckled, with a you understand, madam expression. Lu Hongluan raised her hand to cover her red lips, with some disbelief in her eyes. Xiao Qi was famous for being a womanizer. Except that she was born a girl, her personality was no different from that of a boy. She would also secretly have trysts with men at night. Lu Hongluan was shocked for a moment, and a faint sour taste suddenly appeared between his eyebrows. No wonder she was hiding it from her, spending the whole night with Xiao Qi, causing her to worry for half the night, so heartless. Lu Hongluan thought for a moment, took Nightingale's little hand, and said softly, well, Nightingale, please take me in and take a look, don't disturb Ling. Nightingale blinked her big eyes and hesitated for a moment. Madam, are you sure? Lu Hongluan's face turned red. I just care about your child. You take me there, and when we get back to the palace, I will ask your child to marry you together, my concubine. Nightingale looked back, and without hesitation for too long, she gently pulled Lu Hongluan into the courtyard. On a cold winter night, the yard was quite quiet. The lights were still on in Xiao Qi's boudoir, and there was some laughter. One of them was Su Buling, saying something like Kikai, be good. And Xiao Qi's voice. Slow down. His voice was soft and his breath was unstable. When Lu Hongluan heard this voice, his face suddenly turned red. Although he had never experienced it, he had heard about it. How could he not understand what was going on inside? She thought two people were talking about love together. Oh my God. Lu Hongluan covered her mouth and nose with her hands, not daring to make a sound. She just felt that her worldview had collapsed. He Xiang just detoxifies and just obeys the authority in urgent matters. Why is it like this with Xiao Qi? Why did Xiao Qi agree? It's only been a few days. Nightingale's face also turned red, but she was used to it, so she didn't hesitate. She pulled Mrs. Lu to the room and motioned to go over to take a look. Lu Hongluan's face was so red that it seemed like tears were about to burst out. She didn't dare to go to the window to look. She secretly spit and her heart beat very fast, and her shoulders trembled slightly. She turned around and ran out. Nightingale knew that Lu Hongluan didn't dare to look, so she giggled and followed her out, explaining in a low voice, Madam, I said that the young master and Miss Xiao were discussing something. Continuing the family line is a big deal. I didn't lie to you. You little girl, who did you learn this from? How could you bring me in for such a thing? Just tell me, your concubine is gone. Ah. Madam, let's talk it over. Lu Hongluan was an innocent woman after all. Seeing something she shouldn't have seen, even her breathing was a little messy. Her steps were sometimes fast and sometimes slow. She walked to the entrance of the yard and looked back. The lights in the house were still on. Her eyes were a little strange. She hesitated for a moment, but she didn't want to disturb the two people's good things. She ran back with her head down, but judging from her appearance, she would definitely not be able to sleep tonight. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 470. After being beaten by his father-in-law in a mixed doubles match on the West Lake, Su Buling also gave up the idea of sneaking into the palace to find out the news. He waited patiently for King Wu to return the jade and deepened his relationship with Miss Xiao. It's just that the little cotton-padded nightingale suddenly turned into a black-hearted cotton, and brought Aunt Lu in to watch a play, which made Su Buling miserable. When we got there the next day, Aunt Lu, who was full of jealousy, called her over. Her waist was pinched and swollen, so she managed to coax her back to health with both soft and hard hands and mouth. Fortunately, Xiaoqi didn't notice, otherwise the end would have been even worse. On the Huainan side, with the return of Master Zhongli and his disciples, the atmosphere gradually became weird. Since the last heart-to-heart exchange with Song Yufu, Zhongli Chuchu and this young lady from a good family have become close friends and have stayed together from morning to night. Although nothing happened with Ning Qingyi, they still have a mutual relationship with each other. But there was a sense of distance. Ning Qingyi grew up with her master. She doesn't know much about the ways of the world and has a straight personality, but she is not stupid. At first, Song Yufu was like this, which could be interpreted as a lack of common language between civil and military people, but it was obviously a bit strange that Zhongli and Chuchu, who had a good relationship with each other before, were like this. At noon, in a tea house in Huainan City, a storyteller was telling about the recent events in the world. Ning Qingyi sat by the window of the tea house, basking in the little winter sunday. Her snow-gray skin was exposed to the warm eyes, crystal clear and hazy. Even in winter, she still wore a thin white dress, with a fairy air, but it also displays all the tall and graceful shengduanur, just like a young bamboo shoot in the bamboo forest, which makes people salivate. Zhu Manzi is also dressed as a chivalrous girl, with long hair, shawl and bright eyes and white teeth. Unfortunately, she does not have any chivalry in her body. She lazily supports her chin with her hands. She may be a little tired. Her breasts are resting on the table and she looks bulging. Very bluffing. Ning Qingyi didn't like listening to books very much, so she just stayed with Manzi. His eyes glanced at Manzi, and after thinking about it, he also tried to put his chest on the table, but it turned out that he was too tall, so he gave up. She frowned and thought for a moment, then asked softly, "Manzi, did I say something wrong recently?" When Zhu Manzi heard this, he said softly, "You have never said it right. You are as straightforward as you, and you can't even last 3 times in the storyteller's mouth." Ning Qingyi tilted her head slightly and recalled it carefully, feeling a little confused. "I told the truth, and I didn't say anything to Miss Song and Miss Chuchu. I found that the way they looked at me recently was wrong. They were not as close as before." Zhu Manzi actually found that Song Yufu and Zhongli Chuchu were a little weird recently, but she never cared about this and said casually, "Beauties look down on each other. Maybe they feel that we are too close to Mr. Su, so they feel dissatisfied. This is the case in the back houses of wealthy families. Storytellers often talk about this." Ning Qingyi blinked and looked at Zhu Manzi with a frown. "It doesn't matter if you exclude me, what does that have to do with you?" Zhu Manzi suddenly became unhappy. He sat up straight, looked down at his chest, straightened it up again, and then said, "Do you understand? Besides, I'm not much worse than you in appearance. I'm just a little shorter. This is called roundness. Do you think a bamboo pole like you is good looking?" Ning Qingyi did not deny this, and thought about it carefully. "Even so, Su Buling and I have nothing to do with each other. We are just brothers and sisters. They should not want to see you. How can they alienate me?" Zhu Manzi snorted secretly and waved his hand. "How do I know? You want to go yourself." Naturally, Ning Qingyi couldn't figure it out. She felt that she had done nothing wrong and she wasn't jealous of others, so she thought about it for a while. "Tell me, could it be Ye Juniang who is fanning the flames behind this?" Zhu Manzi shook his head. "Das Hong is dragged around by Sister Xiang every day to chat about family affairs. How can he have time to talk to us little girls? Don't think so much." Ning Qingyi had always had a clear distinction between love and hate. She didn't know how to deal with this unclear situation. She couldn't figure it out after much thought, so she had to put it aside. On the other side, the Xiangshan view outside Huainan City. Xiangshan Temple is a Taoist temple with a relatively remote location. High-ranking families in the city generally do not come here to burn incense, and the scale is naturally not large. Only nearby villagers come here occasionally. In the wing room for pilgrims at the back of the Taoist temple, Ning Yuhi sat alone on a futon and meditated. His long black hair was tied up, and his Taoist robe was draped on his body. He did not apply makeup on his cheeks, and he looked like an immortal. However, since his disciple took away his body, Ning Yuhi obviously could no longer practice meditation. He should have been able to relax his mind while meditating, but at this time, some messy scenes were recollecting in his mind. As a Quanzhen disciple, someone from a Taoist sect will definitely feel guilty when thinking about these things that break the precepts. Ning Yuhi tried to brush away the thoughts in his heart, but the more he stopped thinking about it, the more things he recalled, and in the end he had no choice but to let it go. After Su Buling left, Ning Yuhi never returned to Zaijiazhuang. Last time he was almost discovered by Song Yufu, and he didn't dare to contact anyone. He didn't even see his apprentice. In the spirit of time can dilute everything, he wanted to things drag on. But there are no people there, no information, and no one knows what is going on in Zhuangzi. Ning Yu calculated the time and hid for half a month. The matter should have passed, so she thought of sneaking back to Zhuangzi to take a look. It was still dark, and while I was waiting in the room, a little sparrow suddenly appeared outside the room. It stopped at the window and took a few glances, then flapped its wings and flew out. Ning Yuhi opened his eyes and secretly felt that the bird looked familiar. He stood up and picked up the sword from the table. He came to the window and took a look. As a result, he saw a woman wearing an aqua skirt standing on the wall outside the Taoist temple. With one hand on his waist and a knife hanging on his waist, looking this way. Their eyes met, murderous intent suddenly aroused. Ning Yuhi's face darkened, he jumped out of the window, jumped up to the roof while rising and falling, the sword in his hand was unsheathed with a gleam of cold light, and he scolded. "You witch, you still dare to come back. If I don't beat you to death today, I will." Ning Yuhi was full of murderous intent. According to the previous route, Zhongli Jiju would definitely turn around and run away, and be chased for more than 10 miles. But for some reason, Zhongli Jiju was very courageous today. She didn't even try to hide. She opened her arms with a smile and looked like she was going to die calmly. Come on, try to poke me." Ning Yuhi was afraid that Su Buling would be angry, so he really didn't dare to stab Zhongli Jiju. But last time Zhongli Jiju drugged her, causing her to go crazy and push her apprentice. How could she bear this tone? Ning Yuhi stopped in front of Zhongli Jiju, pointed the sword at her throat, and said coldly, "Get out of the Central Plains immediately, or you won't blame me for being rude." The corners of Zhongli Jiju's mouth curled up slightly, revealing a very seductive smile. He don't be so angry. We are all Su Buling's masters. We will never see you again without looking up. Are they all Su Buling's master? Ning Yuhi frowned and said coldly, "What are you talking about? Your child is not your disciple, so don't have any wishful thinking." He. Zhongli Jiju crossed his arms across his chest, motioned to the knife on his waist, and raised his slender eyebrows. "This is not up to you. Have you seen this Minghong sword? It is one of the most important weapons of your country in the Central Plains. It is more powerful than Su Buling's own sword. It was specially given to me as a gift from the master. He probably has never given it to you. What is it? That's right, your master can't teach you anything, so he is naturally not so considerate to you." Ning Yuhi didn't believe it at all. Su Buling had promised her in bed. Unless he didn't want to touch her in the future, he couldn't go back on his words, let alone Zhongli Jiju come back and make her angry. Ning Yuhi snorted lightly, put away his sword, and said in a cold voice, "None of the 10 words you said is true. It is impossible for your child to become your disciple." Seeing that Ning Yuhi was not fooled, Zhongli Jiju sighed quietly, you must be self-aware. You know my abilities. I can teach Su Buling a lot, and he is willing to worship me as his teacher. Women are jealous, it probably won't end well. If you insist on fanning the flames and obstructing things behind your back, it will be counterproductive over time. I'm not here to show off your power. I'm just here to advise you. Don't ruin your relationship with Su Buling in one breath. Be honest. If you really give in, give Su Buletin a step down, let him feel at ease and accept me as his teacher, and this matter will be over. Although Ning Yuhi hated Zhongli Jiju, she was telling the truth. She couldn't teach Su Buring anything, but Zhongli Jiju could teach him a lot, but she was extremely reluctant to let Zhongli Jiju get involved with Su Buling. I don't believe it. When your son comes back, I will ask him clearly. If he really wants to become your teacher, I will. Zhongli Jiju stood in front and said with a smile, what can you do? You can't force Su Buling to kick me out. I know that you secretly like Su Buling. If you insist on blocking it. When Ning Yuhi heard this, he didn't have any trouble in his heart, as long as he didn't know that she was sleeping with her apprentice. But on the surface, I still have to pretend to be a little softer. You drugged me, you can't take it seriously. Zhongli Jiju sighed, don't worry, as long as you don't stop me from becoming his master, I will keep it secret and not tell Su Buling. Ning Yuhi looked ashamed and angry, and said coldly. You dare to threaten me? Zhongli Jiju gently spread his hands, how can this be called a threat? This is called matchmaking. If you don't want Su Buring to know. Ning Yuhi snorted coldly, if you have the ability, tell Ling and see if he believes you. Zhongli Jiju was confused. She didn't expect that Ning Yuhi had such a strong tone because he was holding Ning Yuhi's hand. Wasn't he afraid that she would tell Su Buling? If you continue to obstruct me, I will tell Su Buling. Go ahead and tell him, he won't believe you. Hey dash. Zhongli Jiju held it in for a long time, frowned and said. I really said, don't regret it. Now that you've given in, there's still room for negotiation. Just say it if you can, I don't care. If you want to be your master, give up as soon as possible. Ning Yu closed her head and went directly back to the Taoist temple. Zhongli Jiju looked a little confused, and wanted to catch up and try to persuade him, but Ning Yu closed the door, looking like he would rather die than compromise. Seeing this, Zhongli Jiju could only say don't regret it and left the Taoist temple with 3 steps.